All right, listeners, thank you for rejoining us here on the Al Nathan Show. We're still here with Robert Weiner, Democratic strategist, columnist, and former communications director for Drug Czar General Barry McCaffrey. Thanks for sticking around here. Continuing on from what we were talking about in the last segment, the COVID relief bill, some of the progressives in Congress have been making some rumblings about, opposing it over, I guess, the lack of minimum wage requirements in it and some other aspects after the Senate revised it. Do you see some sort of unlikely alliance between them and the Republicans who don't want to see it passed either, or are there enough moderates and Democrats in the Congress for we don't have to worry about that?
Well, Bernie said it's the most progressive bill in his lifetime. We're disappointed. I think everyone in America is disappointed that people who live at the poverty level aren't going to be allowed an increase in the minimum wage. That's sort of ridiculous. And to not do it because the parliamentarian tells you that, I think this could result, and I listened very carefully to Manchin, who in the 50-50 is the decider, on his position on the filibuster, and he said he just wants to make sure that there's some hurt involved in the filibuster. So he is open to some strategy of where this could go. And I suggested, I'm on record suggesting, actually before Rachel Maddow suggested it, that what could be done is a reform where you tighten it so that it's not just judicial appointments now, Supreme Court and other court appointments, but it will also be for specific legislation like democratic process legislation. If you do that, then it's very possible that H.R. 1 could pass. Probably on infrastructure, they won't need it. That was just bizarre. That's always been so bipartisan because every member of Congress loves the money that goes to their district when you're talking about roads and railroads and tunnels and all of that, that desperately, 40% of our bridges are unsafe and they're crashing, and you got about every other year some big bridge that falls into the river. We've got to fix that stuff. And we have to fix our trains, which are pathetic compared to our 60, 70, 80 miles, and even if we go that mile an hour compared to the 200 mile an hour European trains. We are so far behind. And I talked to Clyburn about that directly, and he said the Republicans just haven't wanted to pay for it. I think that's something that in the past they have. McConnell, I think, will be cooperative on that. He wants to protect his majority. The COVID relief bill was a 75% popularity item, and people are going to love the programs when they kick in. Just like health care grew by 20 points after it kicked in, after Obamacare kicked in. And he doesn't want to lose every wedge he's got for his majority return, which he might get. So I think infrastructure is going to pass and might not need even a filibuster action.
Oh, that should be having bipartisan support. Like you said, all the money, but on top of that, I could have sworn Trump was talking about doing infrastructure reform, and he got elected over that.
Yeah, then he would tweet himself out of his headlines and tweet himself. I had a piece in the Philadelphia Inquirer, Mr. President, where's that infrastructure bill? And it went into the places in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania as well as the rest of the country that were desperately needed. And right after that article, he announced another infrastructure week, and then some headline jumped at him, and he, So Trump was the master of stepping on his own headlines, and he just was so compulsive about being in the news every other hour that he couldn't stand it when, for strategic reasons for an issue, it would be better. Biden will not fall into that trap. His team and he are very good about keeping on message. And so I think it's going to work this time, as it has for every other president until Trump, to do infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah, like I just brought up Trump as the example because, his voters, you can't exactly call all of them moderates or anything like that. But at the same time, everyone was on board with him for infrastructure reform until he botched it, by moving on to the next shiny object. So there really should have been widespread support in Congress for the reforms.
Well, even in states like Texas, where the grid was such an awful situation and resulted in this horrible energy shortage that they jacked it up to $17,000 a person. So there's a lot of infrastructure, and we've expanded the definition now to things like that needs to be fixed. and that's now where it gets a little dicey is in the paying, and that's where Manchin is saying he might agree with the Republicans on taxes, but on the which taxes. Manchin wants the corporate and the rich taxes of the $2 trillion that 80% of it went to the rich, and he wants that to be retrofitted back to where it was as the source of the money. I don't know the Republicans are going to agree with that, so we might get into a little bit of a squabble over that, but I think that's solvable.
All right, now another item before the House that I mentioned to you before the show was the statehood for Puerto Rico. That was an interesting drive to me. What's your take on that? I mean, does that even have support among Democrats?
Well, it's not a matter of even throwing paper towels at the people who needed the help. The problem is that Puerto Ricans do not pay income tax, and that's why they have always supported Commonwealth. And sometimes they've had some referendums that don't say, and are you willing to pay taxes? Because when you put that into it, the answer is no! And
even in their latest vote that they had, it was 630,000 or so who were in favor of statehood, and that was 52% of the vote in the referendum, but there's 2.3 million voters eligible, so a lot sat it out, right, like they did in previous years. A lot sat it out in their votes for statehood that passed. So, it seems the citizens, like you just said, probably aren't on board with it either.
That's right. And I did one of my history graduate papers a million years ago on the three options in Puerto Rico, which are Commonwealth, statehood, and independence. And they always want Commonwealth as the status quo because they get some benefits, but, not as many as they'd want from the states, from the mainland. And so that's a serious issue over there. And one of my assistants at the National Press Club is a Puerto Rican. He goes back and forth, and he couldn't get out of that argument either. He was saying, yeah, statehood, state, and then I said, what about taxes? No, not taxes. Oh, come on, guys. So that's the issue, and it's a serious issue, and it's not solved. And until that one is resolved, they're not going to statehood.
Yeah. Now, as for the bill that's before Congress, though, why introduce it now of all times, especially since once it does pass, Puerto Rico will have statehood and it'll be eligible for a lot of what we're handing out as far as COVID relief goes and other big spending projects. I guess you got 30 seconds left based on the music to answer that big question. Sorry.
I think that's not going to ultimately go somewhere for the reasons we just described. I think it'll be introduced, but I don't think it's going to pass at this point.
Okay. Bob Weiner, thank you for joining us today on the Alan Nathan Show. Listeners, always appreciate when you tune into us as well, but don't forget, you can get us on Facebook, Twitter, and Parler, so check us out. Main Street Radio Network, Alan Nathan Show, and obviously, Alan will be back tomorrow, and I will be with you sometime in the future.